Dear Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, dear friends, it's a real privilege to talk today, and let me express first my gratitude to our President, Ambassador Katalin Bolyai, having me invited. And my role today is to talk about the Palestinian issue, which it seems one of the most important, challenging issue for when we are talking about credibility, and especially when we are moving away from a rule-based order, I think, to an order which we cannot define at the moment, even it's a G0 or a multipolar world or a multiplex world. It's a question, but I think United Nations and dialogue especially still playing a very fundamental role in bringing peace to variety of conflicts. So since its inception, the United Nations has played a significant role in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and one of the first manifestations of the two-state solution was the adoption of the so-called partition resolution by the United Nations General Assembly in 1947, which would have created a Jewish and an Arab state. This later formed the basis for the declaration of independence of the State of Israel in May 1948. Another significant milestone in the history of the Arab-Israeli wars was United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, adopted after the Six-Day War in 1967, which recognizes Israel's right to exist within secure and recognized borders and calls on Israel to withdraw from the so-called occupied territories. This principle later formed the basis for the adoption of the Oslo Accords in 1993, which reinforced the principle of land for peace. However, it is important to mention and recall the December 1988 session of the United Nations General Assembly outside its New York headquarters, at which Yasser Arafat, representing the Palestine Liberation Organization, announced the declaration of independence of the State of Palestine. U.S. Secretary of State Schultz rejected Arafat and his delegation's request for traveling to the United States, referring to Washington's evidence that the PLO was involved in different terrorist activities. The United Nations upheld the Palestinian request, and the General Assembly voted in favor of the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, which was opposed by certain state members. The situation in 1988 is quite similar to the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, where the delegation led by Mahmoud Abbas, representing the Palestinian Authority, was denied to enter the United States. Once again, a legal dispute similar to that of 1988 began over whether the United States was violating the UN headquarters agreement under which it should allow foreign delegations to enter. However, the US claimed that it had the right to refuse the admission of the Palestinian delegation on security grounds. Washington also claims that the Palestinian Authority is taking unilateral steps towards statehood, and in his response, Mahmoud Abbas explained that this was primarily due to the failure of bilateral negotiations. Finally, the United Nations approved Mahmoud Abbas' virtual participation in the General Assembly. The United Nations has thus played a significant historical role in enforcing the right to self-determination, and this is also the case with regard to the Palestinian statehood. Following the 1993 Oslo Declaration of Principles, the United Nations also supported the so-called two-state solution, the 2002 Roadmap for Peace document, under which negotiations took place for a time. The International Conference on the Two-State Solution, held in New York under the co-chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia, I think is another significant step in the field of state recognition. On September the 12th this year, the UN General Assembly adopted the New York Declaration with 142 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, and 10 against, which can be seen as an international support for the Palestinian statehood. According to the declaration, irreversible steps must be taken to create a Palestinian state. state. Over the course of 2 days, more than 10 states, and including many Western states like France, the UK, Belgium, joined in recognizing the Palestinian state, bringing the number of recognitions to 157 out of 193 member states. The UN conference on the two-state solution, which I mentioned, I think the declaration itself reflected in the 20 points peace plan published by Donald Trump last week, despite the fact that Donald Trump is very critical with the United Nations, but he was building on those negotiations and the consensus of different states. So, for instance, including the end of the war, presence of the international stabilization forces, the reform of the Palestinian Authority, and even, I would say, albeit vaguely, but the idea of Palestinian statehood appeared in the document, which I think, we can be critical with the United Nations. However, without this dialogue, it would not have been achieved, in my opinion. So meanwhile, the United Nations member states condemn Hamas activities as well and call on Hamas to release the hostages immediately, which means that the international organization cannot be just accused of bias. With regard to the statehood, the activities of our organization president, Katalin Boya, is very important, because we remember very much when in 2011 the UNESCO accepted Palestine as a member state, which was a significant milestone in the history of this conflict. And I think it is very important to highlight another factor, is the providing humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip, and especially at this moment today, we're just waiting for announcing the ceasefire, which is of course a question, but however, the United Nations Emergency Fund just provided a huge amount of opportunity when ceasefire agreed to enter the Gaza Strip and to provide those who are suffering there. And I think that's another issue, despite again the criticism received by some of the member states of the United Nations, but I think that's very important to mention here. So what we learn from history, I would repeat the same sentences: dialogue, negotiations, listening to each other, and trying to find a kind of consensus would be very important to achieve a lasting peace. And I think this is exactly the same with the Palestinian issue. Thank you so much for your attention.